Well, there he is, Haruki Murakami. What an intense fellow. This is the novel, Colorless, Tsukuru, Tazaki, and His Years of Pilgrimage. And I'm going to be looking at a single page from the novel with this guiding question, which is a very broad guiding question. Examine the key authorial choices in the extract and describe their impact on meaning with an emphasis on theme and or emotional effect. So when you're faced with a prompt like that in the work of creating a literary analysis, your first job is to take something that looks like this and transform it into something that looks like this by noticing what is worth noticing. So I'm going to read through these annotations that I've created, maybe explain some of them about what I think is most significant. Sometimes this work is all about, assigning a specific name to something, like anaphora, or just using the word repetition is pretty good as well. But anaphora is one of those high-dollar literary device words that makes you sound smart, and you are. But the most important work is never just noticing that there's a metaphor or a simile or anaphora or a paradox or things like that. But it's the final step beyond that to examine how those specific choices impact the meaning for the reader. So I think I'll probably read aloud and stop in certain moments to talk about things. The summer after he returned to Tokyo from Nagoya, Tsukuru was transfixed by the odd sensation that physically he was being completely transformed. Colors he'd once seen appeared completely different, as if they'd been covered by a special filter. He heard sounds that he'd never heard before and couldn't make out other noises that had always been familiar. When he moved, he felt clumsy and awkward, as if gravity were shifting around him. Now, there's several of these little comparisons that are similes. Is it worth discussing? Is it worth writing a paragraph about? Maybe his use of simile throughout this extract might be something that would be worth talking about, but maybe not. Maybe it's just something that you notice that's in his toolkit, but when it comes to the full meaning, it's not as interesting or significant as some other choices that he made. For the 5 months after he returned to Tokyo, Tsukuru lived at death's door. So I think for me, this is where things get interesting, and they get very Murakami. And so if you can notice the authorial choices that are like the Murakami choices, the things that make him worth examining as like a guy who might deserve the Nobel Prize for his literature, things like that, you're probably getting closer to something that's worth writing about. So this, for the 5 months after he returned to Tokyo, Tsukuru lived at death's door. Death's door is a familiar metaphor, and I'm not sure if it exists in Japanese, because this is translated from Japanese, but in English, it's a very common thing to say, oh, he was at death's door. He was at death's, really bad. So it's a familiar metaphor. To saying that he lived at death's door is also a metaphor, but he set up a tiny place to dwell. Now that's interesting, because by saying that he lived at death's door, which is a familiar, almost trite or tired phrase, he lived at death's door, he set up a tiny place to dwell. What's interesting or surprising is that he extended that familiar metaphor of death's door and didn't describe death's door, but he's going to talk about the living and what the living is like in that tiny place to dwell. So that's interesting and very Murakami. All by himself on the rim of a dark abyss. And so throughout, this metaphor is extended. Really, probably about this much of the text is really living in the land of that metaphor. But because it's Murakami and it's surrealist, things get weird with this metaphor like they frequently do. This is a signature stylistic aspect of Murakami's fiction. A perilous spot, teetering on the edge, where if he rolled over in his sleep, he might plunge into the depth of the void. Yet he wasn't afraid. So now, have we left the land of the metaphor? Who is saying this? Yet he wasn't afraid. The narrator here, this is all the narrator's description of Tsukuru's experience. So what was he not afraid of? He wasn't afraid in general. He was just not afraid, or he was not afraid of this specific metaphor. He was not afraid of falling into this perilous spot. And that makes us think about, like, whose metaphor is this? Is this Tsukuru's metaphor that he, in his own little mental landscape, uses to describe the world that he lives in? Or is that the work of this outside narrator that is giving us insight into what's going on with Tsukuru? All he thought about was how easy it would be to fall in. All around him, as far as he could see, lay a rough land strewn with rocks. And so now into this metaphor, we've got some setting, we've got some landscape, we've got some imagery, powerful imagery, but it's within this metaphor. This landscape is now being described in detail. A rough land strewn with rocks, with not a drop of water, nor a blade of grass. Colorless. So this, of all the different things, I double underlined that, so that must have been kind of important on my reading, my analytical reading. But colorless, I put it in a box, just like I put death's door in a box. Well, it must be really important. Well, even if you only had this extract in front of you, you would know that the title of the work is Colorless Tsukuru Tazaki. So any mention of the word colorless is like red alert. There's something going on here that is very significant. Colorless, with no light to speak of, no sun, no moon or stars, no sense of direction either. So there's a little bit of repetition. Repetition, like, it operates on a continuum. This is light repetition, or a minor anaphora, I guess you could call it. Is it that significant? Is it worth talking about? Not necessarily. This is why, when it comes to, some people like to use a framework like this for analysis, where almost like write a paragraph about each one of these. I think not everything is significant just because you notice it. So it's good to notice everything, but when it comes to do your actual writing and analysis, it's better to think about what is the work trying to communicate than imposing on it because some things might be fairly arbitrary. Something to think about. No set time, a mysterious twilight and a bottomless darkness, merely exchanged places, a remote border on the edge of consciousness. At the same time, it was a place of strange abundance. At twilight, birds with razor-sharp beaks came to relentlessly scoop out his flesh. But as darkness covered the land, the birds would fly off somewhere, and that land would suddenly fill in the gaps in his flesh with something else, some other indeterminate material. Classic Murakami right there. Like, what are you talking about? Imagery and the narrative within the metaphor. So, there's narrative. There's something is happening to him in this metaphor. Landscape is colorless. So my significant thought, and this would probably be close to a thesis statement that I would, if I were going to, write about all these things that I've noticed, I probably wouldn't talk about this repetition here because it might not fit in to my analysis and might not be that significant when it comes to this, which is the book an exploration of this landscape? Or is the passage like this landscape is colorless? Is that what the whole book is doing? Is just saying there's a place, and it's depression, it's mental illness, it's suffering, loss. And is the book really just an exploration of this loss and then repairing the damage from this loss? Is a question. Tsukuru couldn't fathom what this substance was. Again, if this metaphor was constructed by the narrative voice to explain an emotional reality for the character, why would Tsukuru have an opinion about this substance? Do you get what I'm saying? unless this is his understanding. But that's so weird. So weird. So like destabilizing. And that's really what Murakami does. Is he destabilizes, decentralizes the narrative force and just makes everything becomes jumbled together. So is it a metaphor or a dream? Because now it seems like, oh, okay, I get it. He couldn't fathom what the substance was, because you could imagine a character recalling a dream that he had and then wrestling with like, gosh, what does this mean? But this was never framed as a dream. This was framed as a metaphor used to describe an emotional reality that's difficult to describe. Tsukuru couldn't fathom what this substance was. He couldn't accept or reject it. It merely settled on his body. What? We're still in the framework of the metaphor, I guess. We're still in the metaphor. It merely settled on his body as a shadowy swarm, laying an ample amount of shadowy eggs. Then darkness would withdraw and twilight would return. So now we're in this time. There's like time in this narrative, in this metaphor. There's days are going by, bringing with the birds who once again slashed away at his body. He was himself then, but at the same time he was not. He was Tsukuru Tazaki and not Tsukuru Tazaki. Paradox. When he couldn't stand the pain, he distanced himself from his body and, from a nearby, painless spot, observed Tsukuru Tazaki enduring the agony. If he concentrated really hard, it wasn't impossible. So again, this is the same thing. Like he concentrated on the metaphor, he concentrated on the dream, or this is something that he regularly did. Now it's like we've like slowly like moved out of the metaphor, and now we're talking about just how he generally felt, which makes sense. If he concentrated really hard, it wasn't impossible. I said irony here. I can't remember what I thought the irony was. That's how these things go. Enduring the agony. If he concentrated really hard, it wasn't impossible. It wasn't impossible to distance himself from his body so he could observe himself enduring the agony. Enduring the agony of this metaphor, like the specific agony of birds ripping his body out, but that was a metaphor. That didn't really happen, right? So he wasn't impossible to... That's Murakami.